Ethan was not a soldier, and he was not a leader, and he was not someone who carried power in the colony, because he was only a simple engineer who fixed the broken machines and kept the power lines alive in the outpost that humans had built under the shadow of the tall alien towers, but in his heart he carried a quiet fire that nobody noticed and nobody cared for because he looked like every other man who had been sent so far from Earth. The alien world was not kind, and the skies were red with dust, and the mountains stood sharp like blades, and the alien people who ruled here were taller than any human and stronger, and their voices carried like thunder when they walked past the human workers who bent their heads down because rules were strict and rules were heavy, and rules said that no human should speak too much or stare too long or try to touch what was not his. Ethan lived like the others with fear in his stomach and silence in his mouth, but everything changed one night when a storm came rolling over the mining fields because lightning ripped the sky, and the machines screamed, and the tunnels shook with fire, and stone began to fall, and men and women ran as the ground split. But Ethan ran the other way because he had seen someone trapped inside the broken tunnel. The figure he saw was not a human. It was one of them, one of the alien warriors who stood taller than the gates themselves. Her skin shone with a strange silver light under the storm, and her long arms tried to push away the rocks, but even her strength was failing because the collapse was too heavy, and her leg was trapped beneath a stone that looked like a mountain, and her voice was fierce as she struggled alone. Every human would have turned away because helping her was not only dangerous, it was forbidden, and if the commanders saw him near her, he would be punished, maybe even executed for daring to cross the line between human and alien. But Ethan did not think of the punishment. He only thought of the way her chest rose and fell, and the sound of pain in her throat. And he moved forward into the dust and fire, and he pulled with all his small strength to move the stone that held her down. At first it did not move, and his arms burned and his lungs begged for air. But he remembered the machines he had lifted before, and the weight he had carried through his life, and he used every piece of muscle and bone to push against the rock, and at last it shifted just enough for her to drag her leg free, and then she rose like a shadow out of the storm, and he felt his heart freeze because she stood like a tower above him, her head brushing the roof of the tunnel, and her eyes glowing with fire. She looked at him, and for a long moment he thought she would crush him with one blow because her kind saw humans as nothing more than workers and dust. But instead she bent low, and her voice carried something strange. It carried thanks, and it carried respect, and it carried surprise, because never had she seen a small human risk his own life for her, when even her own kind would have left her behind. Her name, she told him, was Lyra, and though he should not have spoken, he whispered his name too, and the storm roared louder, and the ground shook again, and they both knew that if they did not leave the tunnel soon, it would bury them alive. So they ran together through the falling stone and the flashing fire until they reached the open ground where the storm winds howled across the desert and lightning danced across the sky. The other humans stared from a distance when they saw Ethan beside the giant alien woman, and fear spread through them like fire because this was a sight that should never have been seen, and whispers began to grow like snakes in the dark that the engineer had touched what was forbidden and had stood too close to the warriors of the sky, and rumors spread fast in the colony where fear ruled every heart. Ethan felt the eyes on him, and he felt the weight of what he had done because he knew the rules, and he knew the danger, and he knew that his choice might soon cost him his freedom or his life. But when he looked back at Lyra, he saw something in her eyes that made his blood burn. It was not just thanks, and it was not just respect. It was something deeper, something human, something alive. That night he could not sleep, and he lay in his bed with the sound of the storm still in his ears, and the image of her towering figure still burning behind his eyes, and he wondered why he had risked so much for someone who was not his own kind, and why his heart now beat with a rhythm he did not understand, and he knew this was only the beginning of something dangerous and something Forbidden, for in that one act of saving her life he had crossed a line that no human had ever crossed before, and he did not know if it would lead to death or to something even greater than life itself. Days passed after the storm, but Ethan could not escape the weight of what had happened, because in saving the alien warrior woman named Lyra, he had crossed the law of the colony and broken the rule that kept humans alive under alien command. Yet in his heart he did not feel regret, and instead he felt a fire growing, because in that one night he had seen more truth in her eyes than he had seen in years of living in fear among his own kind. The colony tried to return to normal, and machines roared again in the mining fields, and humans kept their heads low as the alien patrols passed by with their weapons and tall shadows. But Ethan noticed that sometimes when the patrols gathered near the edge of the desert, he could see her standing among them, her silver skin glowing in the harsh sun, and her tall figure casting a shadow longer than the walls. And every time their eyes met, even for a moment, he felt that the world shifted under his feet, and he could not breathe at night when silence wrapped the camp. Ethan walked farther than he was allowed, and he found the place where the desert touched the old ruins of stone towers left behind by a civilization long dead. And there, in the darkness, he saw her again, waiting with the stillness of a mountain, and though he knew it was madness, he stepped closer, and she did not stop. And Lyra spoke with a voice that was softer now, away from the ears of her commanders, and she told him that her kind saw humans as small and fragile, but she had seen him face the storm and lift the stone and risk his life, and that was something even warriors of her own people sometimes failed to do. And Ethan listened in silence, because he had never heard words of respect from an alien before, and it filled him with a strange pride that warmed his chest. They began to meet in secret, and each night he walked the same path through the shadows, and each night she was there waiting with her great frame hidden in the ruins, and he told her stories of earth, of oceans and green fields and cities filled with light, while she told him stories of her own people, of great battles fought among the stars, and of honor carried like blood in their veins. And though their worlds were different, they found something familiar in the sound of each other's voices. Ethan began to see her not as the others did, not as a monster, not as a ruler, not as a creature to fear, but as someone who carried loneliness inside her bones, because she was different from her kind. She was softer than them, kinder than them, and they called her weak for it, while he saw her strength in her compassion and in the way she listened when no one else did. But danger grew like a shadow over their meetings, because whispers were already spreading in the colony that the engineer was behaving strangely, walking into the desert alone, staying away from the others, and some eyes began to follow him at night, though he did not know it yet, and some lips began to speak his name with suspicion and jealousy. Still, he kept going, because he could not stop himself, and because every time he looked into her eyes, he felt alive in a way he had never felt before in the gray walls of the colony. And she too could not stop herself, though she knew the punishment for her would be worse than his if they were discovered, because her people would call her a traitor and strip her of her honor, and perhaps even end her life. One night, as they sat among the ruins, the wind cold against their faces, Ethan reached out his hand, though it trembled like a leaf in a storm, and she looked down at it for a long time, as if she were deciding whether to crush it or to take it. And at last her great hand moved, and her long fingers touched his palm, and the size difference was so great that his hand looked like a child's, but the warmth that passed between them was more powerful than fire, and both of them felt the ground of their worlds break apart. The moment passed quickly, because the sound of patrols echoed in the distance, and she pulled away, telling him that they must be careful, that danger was near, and that his people were watching him more closely than before. But Ethan only nodded, because he knew already that he was far beyond the point of turning back, and that he would risk anything to keep seeing her. When he returned to the colony that night, he noticed that some men stared at him with narrow eyes, and one of them whispered too loudly that the engineer thought he was special, and that maybe he had been touched by madness. And Ethan felt the cold bite of fear, because he knew it was only a matter of time before someone followed him and saw the truth of what he was doing. Still, he went back the next night and the night after because something inside him told him that this bond was not something to run from, it was something to protect and something worth more than fear. And when he stood beside her beneath the alien stars, he felt that perhaps the universe itself had brought them together against every law and against every rule and against every wall between human and alien. But far in the distance, unseen by them, both a pair of human eyes watched from the shadows, and lips curled with anger and jealousy because one of their own had dared to touch what was forbidden and dared to see beauty where others saw only danger, and already betrayal was moving quietly like a blade waiting to strike. The nights in the desert had become the only moments when Ethan felt alive, because each time he stepped beyond the walls of the colony and moved through the silence of sand and broken stone, he knew she would be waiting, and the sight of her tall figure rising in the moonlight filled him with strength and hope. Yet the risk grew heavier with every step, because shadows were no longer empty and eyes had begun to follow him with silent suspicion. Among the humans, there was a man named Daniel who had always looked at Ethan with bitterness, because Ethan, though quiet and plain, had earned respect for his work as an engineer, while Daniel was a miner who dreamed of glory but lived in anger. And when he noticed Ethan disappearing each night into the desert, his envy burned into hatred, and he decided to follow him one evening, keeping low and silent through the ruins until he saw the truth with his own eyes. What Daniel saw froze him and fed his rage, because there stood Ethan, small and fragile, beside the towering alien woman Lyra, whose silver skin shone under the stars and whose hand brushed against his shoulder in a gesture that no human should ever receive. And Daniel's heart twisted with both fear and fury, because this was not only against the law, it was against the very order of the colony, and he believed that Ethan, by touching what was forbidden, had betrayed them all. Daniel returned to the colony before Ethan and whispered into the ears of those who would listen, and soon the whispers turned to rumors, and the rumors grew into stories that painted Ethan as a traitor and a fool. And the word reached the ears of the alien commanders who ruled the humans with iron laws, and they too grew curious about what the engineer was hiding. Next night, when Ethan went to the ruins, he did not know that his steps were already marked, and that both humans and aliens were watching from the shadows as he moved to meet Lyra. She greeted him with a voice filled with warmth, but there was worry in her eyes, because she too had heard the shifting winds of danger. And she told him that someone had seen them, someone who might not stay silent, and that soon the walls of secrecy would fall around them. Ethan felt the weight of her words, but he could not let go, and he told her that even if the world turned against them, he would not stop seeing her, because something stronger than fear bound them together. And she looked at him with eyes that burned like fire, and he knew she believed him. But even as they spoke, the trap was already closing. The ground shook with the march of heavy feet, and from the darkness came the alien warriors with their weapons drawn, their tall frames surrounding the ruins, while human overseers followed with torches, and Daniel at their front, his lips curved in triumph as he pointed at Ethan and shouted that here was the traitor who dared to defile the rules of both races by touching what was forbidden. Ethan was seized before he could move his arms, locked by strong hands, and he was dragged into the light of the torches, where the faces of his own people stared at him with fear and anger, some spitting at the ground, while others whispered that he had brought doom upon them all. And the alien commander, a massive figure with armor that gleamed like stone, demanded that Lyra speak the truth of what had happened. For a long moment she was silent, and her eyes moved from Ethan to her commander and back again, and Ethan's heart trembled, because he knew she was standing at the edge of a blade. If she admitted the truth, then her people would strip her of her honor and perhaps end her life. If she denied it, then he would stand alone as a liar and a criminal, and his fate would be sealed in blood. The commander repeated the question louder, his voice like thunder, and the humans pressed closer, eager to see Ethan fall, and Daniel smiled wide, his envy satisfied. And in that moment, Lyra stepped forward, her silver skin shining in the torchlight. And she raised her hand high and struck Ethan across the face with such force that he fell to the ground. Blood, his lips and gasps rose from the crowd because her strike was a rejection, a statement that he was nothing to her, nothing but a human fool who dared too much. Ethan lay on the ground, staring up at her, and though his face burned with pain, he saw her eyes for just a moment, and in those eyes he saw the truth hidden behind the mask she had been forced to wear, because in her gaze there was sorrow, and in her gaze there was love, and he understood that she had not struck him to destroy him. She had struck him to save him from something worse. But the humans did not see the truth, and the aliens did not care for hidden meanings. And Ethan was dragged away in chains, his wrists bound, and his body thrown into a cell of stone, while whispers filled the colony that the engineer had been caught betraying them all, and that he would soon be judged by the alien council who decided life and death with words as sharp as blades. In the darkness of the cell, Ethan felt despair like ice in his veins, because he knew that his secret meetings had been uncovered, and that his own kind had turned against him, and that Lyra had been forced to betray him before all eyes. Yet deep inside, he held to the memory of her gaze, and the silent promise it carried, that she still stood with him, even if the world believed otherwise. Above the cell in the alien halls, Lyra herself faced trial for her actions, and though she had struck Ethan to prove her loyalty, the commanders whispered among themselves that compassion had weakened her, and that she could no longer be trusted, and she stood tall but alone, knowing that the line she had crossed with Ethan could never be erased, and that soon both of them would have to pay the price for a bond neither of them could let go. And so the colony waited in silence while storm clouds gathered over the desert again, and every heart knew that the next days would bring punishment and fire, and that the story of the human who dared to touch an alien woman was far from over. Cell was cold and damp, and Ethan sat with his back against the wall, his wrists bruised from the iron bands and his thoughts heavy like chains around his heart, because he knew that the council of the alien rulers would soon call for him, and his fate would be sealed with their judgment. And he feared not only for his own life, but also for Lyra, because he had seen the doubt in the eyes of her commanders, and he knew they no longer trusted her, and that in the end they might destroy her too for showing kindness to a human. He tried to sleep, but dreams came sharp and cruel, showing him images of her face twisted in pain, or her body falling beneath the weapons of her own people. And each time he woke, he pressed his fists against the stone and swore to himself that he would not let the story end like this, because even if he was only one small man, he could still choose to act, he could still fight for her. The chance came when a friend who worked as a guard brought him a flask of water and leaned close, whispering that not everyone believed the lies, and that some had seen the truth in the way Lyra looked at him, and in the way he had risked his life for her, and that one door in the far corner would be left unguarded for a short time, when the patrol changed, and if Ethan had the courage to run, then he might yet escape, but only if his heart was ready to risk everything. Ethan did not hesitate, because his mind was already decided, and as the torches burned low, he slipped through the shadows and pressed his body against the stone, moving silent and quick. And when the moment came, he pushed the loose bars aside and crawled into the darkness of the tunnels that ran beneath the stronghold, his heart beating loud like a drum with every step. The tunnels twisted like veins beneath the alien halls, and he moved without light, guided only by the memory of the paths he had studied during his work as an engineer. And when he finally rose from the ground into the night air, he saw the towers of the stronghold rising high like black teeth against the stars, and he knew Lyra was somewhere inside, facing judgment from her people. Ethan's body was weak from hunger, and his hands trembled, but his will was iron, because he could not turn back now, and he climbed the outer wall with fingers bleeding from the rough stone pulling. himself higher, though the height was enough to kill him if he fell. And when he reached the ledge, he rolled across and hid among the shadows as alien warriors marched below with heavy steps, their voices sharp as thunder. He moved like a ghost through the halls, avoiding the eyes of the guards, listening to the echoes of their voices until he reached the great chamber where the council had gathered, and there at the center stood Lyra, her tall body chained with glowing bonds, her silver skin dull beneath the torchlight, and her head bowed but her eyes still fierce as the commanders circled her, speaking words of judgment that cut like blades. They accused her of weakness and of betrayal, of lowering herself to the level of a human, and they spoke of stripping her of honor and casting her into exile or death. Ethan felt rage burn through his veins because he knew she had done nothing but show compassion, something that should have been called strength, yet here it was twisted into shame. Before fear could stop him, he stepped from the shadows, and his voice rang across the chamber. Though it trembled and cracked, he shouted that it was not her fault, that it was his choice, that he had gone to her, and that he had dared to reach beyond the line, and that if there was blame, then let it fall on him alone. And the chamber shook with gasps as both humans and aliens turned their eyes to the small figure who stood before them. The commanders roared in fury, demanding his capture, and guards rushed forward. But Ethan did not move. He stood tall, though his legs shook and his body was weak, and he shouted again that he chose her, that he chose Lyra, even if it meant death. And his words echoed through the chamber like fire catching dry grass, because never before had a human spoken so boldly before the rulers. Never before had one stood without fear. Lyra lifted her head. Her eyes blazed with a light that filled Ethan with strength, and in that moment she pulled against her chains, her muscles burning, and with a cry that shook the walls, she snapped the glowing bonds apart, the pieces falling to the floor like broken stars, and she stepped to his side, towering above him, her frame shielding him from the blades of the guards. The commanders were furious, their voices clashing like thunder, and they shouted that this was treason and that both of them would be destroyed. Yet the hall was filled now with whispers among the other aliens, because they had seen something rare in her defiance and in his courage, something that stirred doubt in their hearts, because humans had always been called weak and fragile, but this one stood with more fire than many warriors. Ethan placed his hand against Lyra's arm, though his hand looked small as a child's against her skin, and he whispered that he was not afraid. And she looked down at him with a gaze filled with both sorrow and pride, because she knew the risk they had taken together could not be undone, and that the next breath might bring their end. But still they stood side by side, facing the council, facing the anger of the rulers, facing the edge of war, and in that moment, both of them understood that their bond had already changed the future, because whether they lived or died, they had shown the truth that a human and an alien could choose each other, even against the weight of fear and law. The chamber filled with noise as the commanders debated among themselves, some demanding blood and others calling for judgment more measured, and the tension grew heavy like a storm waiting to break, and Ethan felt the world balance on a knife edge where one word could decide life or death for them both. And so the night stretched long and heavy as he and Lyra stood together unbroken, waiting for the final choice that would seal their fate and the fate of all who watched. The great chamber was filled with firelight, and the voices of the alien commanders clashed like thunder as they argued over what to do with Ethan and Lyra, and the guards stood ready with weapons while the humans pressed against the walls, their faces pale with fear, because they had never seen such defiance, and they did not know if the next breath would bring death for all of them. Ethan stood with his back straight, though his body was trembling, and blood still marked his face from the strike. Lyra had given him the night before, but now he no longer cared about pain or fear, because he had chosen already, and there was no turning back. And when the commanders shouted for silence, he raised his voice and told them that he would not beg and he would not deny what had happened, because it was his choice to stand with her and to risk everything for her. The chamber fell silent for a moment, and the words echoed among the stone walls, and even the alien guards shifted uneasily because they had never heard a human speak with such fire and such certainty, and Lyra placed her massive hand on his shoulder and told the council that if they wished to punish someone, then let them punish her, because she had chosen him as well, and she would not take back that choice. Even if it cost her life. The council erupted in anger, and voices shouted for death, but others whispered among themselves that such courage from a human was rare, and that such loyalty from a warrior was not weakness but strength. And slowly a division spread through the rulers, some demanding blood to preserve order, and others saying that perhaps a new path was possible because they had seen proof that fear did not have to rule forever. Ethan felt the weight of their judgment pressing down like a mountain, and he knew that one wrong word could end them, but he also knew he could not let this chance pass, and so he stepped forward until the guards lowered their spears against his chest, and still he did not stop, and he cried out that humans were more than workers and more than dust, that they had hearts that could burn like stars, and that if his death was the price to prove it, then he would pay it gladly. But no one could take away the truth of his choice. The words struck the chamber like lightning, and even the humans who had once whispered against him now stared with wide eyes, because in his voice they heard something they had forgotten, something called hope, and some felt their own hearts rise from the dust for the first time in years. And Lyra looked down at him with pride brighter than the fire of the torches, and she raised her arms wide, daring her commanders to strike her down. The council finally called for silence, and the eldest of them rose, his armor old and scarred from battles fought long before Ethan was born, and his voice was heavy as stone as he declared that killing them would only feed more whispers and more defiance, and that exile would serve better than blood, because exile was a living death. And yet it would end the danger without spilling more fire into the colony. And the other commanders argued, but in the end his voice carried the weight of age and power, and so the judgment was made. Exile Ethan and Lyra were to be cast out from both human and alien walls, and sent into the far wilderness beyond the mountains, where no one returned and no one survived, and for many it was the same as a death sentence. But for Ethan, it was not death, it was freedom, because it meant he could walk beside her without chains and without lies, even if the world beyond was filled with danger. The guards unchained Lyra and pushed them both through the gates, and the humans watched in silence, some with pity, some with fear. But in the eyes of a few, there was respect now, a spark that had not been there before, and Ethan felt it as he took her hand, small against hers but steady and strong, and together they stepped into the endless desert with the stars burning above them. The nights were cold, and the days were cruel, but they did not falter because they had chosen each other. And in their bond was strength that no rule and no law could break. And when storms rose, they built shelter together, and when hunger came, they hunted side by side. And slowly, step by step, they moved farther from the colony, until the towers of the aliens were nothing but shadows behind them. Lyra walked with her head high, though exile had stripped her of honor in the eyes of her people, and Ethan walked with fire in his chest, because he had found something greater than fear and greater than survival. He had found love that could rise even in the ashes of two worlds, and though the road ahead was unknown, he knew that he would never walk it alone. One night, as they sat by the fire built from dry branches and watched the moons drift across the sky, Ethan turned to her and told her that if he had to choose again, he would still choose her 1,000 times, and she bent her head low so that her eyes met his, and she told him that among her people there was no greater honor than to stand with one who would risk all for love, and that in her heart he had given her more than a world of victories. The fire cracked and the desert wind sang around them, and Ethan felt peace for the first time since he had left Earth, because though he had lost a home and though he had lost a people, he had gained something larger and brighter, a bond that no exile and no fear could take away. And so the story of the human engineer who dared to reach beyond the wall and the alien warrior, woman who chose compassion over law, did not end in chains or in blood, but in freedom and in love as they walked together into the wild, Horizon leaving behind a world that could not yet understand them, but perhaps one day would the end.